Works of theology, philosophy, and even legal theory often begin with a study of epistemology, or the science of how we understand and know anything, considering what are the conditions of knowledge, what are knowledge's limits. And when it comes to theology specifically, there's often an analysis of the relationship between what might be considered natural knowledge and revealed knowledge. Think here of the introduction to Thomas Aquinas' Summa Theologica and the important questions that he asks about rationality, revelation, and proofs of God's existence. In some ways, Abu Hamid al-Ghazali's Ihya Ulum ad-Din, or the revival of the religious sciences, begins with what looks like a similar study. The first book of this 40-book impressive work is called the Book of Knowledge. And he begins by laying out the importance of the virtue of knowledge, of learning, and of teaching. However, on closer inspection, his analysis of the values and virtues of knowledge are not actually an epistemological study at all. He doesn't offer, in fact, justifications of how we come to know, of the relationship between reason and revelation. Instead, he begins each of these three sections on knowledge, learning, and teaching with a fundamental assumption about the givenness of his religious identity and religious authorities. So each begin with a study of the Quran, of the prophetic hadith, and then of a study of the companions. These aren't actually exegetical analyses, but simply citations of authority. So, for instance, he lists a series of Quranic ayah that reference knowledge. So here's one, for example, from Surah Al-Ankabut, where he says, quote, "And these examples we present to the people, but none will understand them except for those who have knowledge." So knowledge then becomes vital for understanding the divine revelation or the prophetic voice. Similarly, he lists a series of hadith, which he gives a little bit more commentary on than the Quran. So, for instance, he says this, quote, from Abu Dawood, "The scholars, or the ulama, are the heirs of the Prophet." Ghazali goes on to riff on this, saying, quote, "It is well known that there is no degree above that of prophecy." Of course, this is a central commitment of the Islamic tradition, that the Prophet and the seal of the Prophet becomes central for understanding and knowledge. But the ulama become heirs of this tradition. So what you see al-Ghazali doing is not offering a study of epistemology as such, not offering an argument about the importance of revelation over and against what can be known rationally, but instead, as we noted in our last video, doing something very similar that you might find in a fiqh textbook. For those of you who are not familiar with Islamic legal tradition and jurisprudence, the grounding of fiqh, or Islamic jurisprudence, or the Sharia, are God's revelations, more specifically God's book, or God's speech, the Quran, as well as the hadith, or prophetic tradition. So insofar as Ghazali aims to mimic these textbooks, beginning with citations of the importance of knowledge, of learning, and of teaching from the Quran and the hadith and the companions, would lead one into this assumption, right? If you've picked this book up expecting a legal textbook, it's not surprising that you have a list of these traditions. Having shown the importance of the divine revelation for knowledge, you might then expect Ghazali to suddenly turn to the next tools in a jurisprudential toolbox. In the Islamic tradition, this would be first and foremost ijma, especially coming from the Shafi'i tradition that al-Ghazali comes from, as well as analogy or qiyas. However, Ghazali doesn't make these moves. Instead, what he offers is both a rational proof for the importance of knowledge and an elucidation of its place. He does this, of course, within the entire framework of his aims of the Ihya, which is to turn the religious sciences away from a fixation on worldly gain and towards their proper but limited place as guides or tools in the science of the hereafter. What he argues is that knowledge is one of the most, if not the most, fundamental and essential virtue on this journey. Part of that has to do with the claims that he has earlier made, but it also has to do with his argument about what things are. He lays out that there's two different kinds of things: those that are good in and of themselves, and those that are good insofar as they lead towards other things. But as is often the case in much Islamic discourse, he offers a third or a middle way, where something is both good in and of itself and good insofar as it leads towards something else. Knowledge is both of these. Knowledge is a good in and of itself, so it's worth seeking knowledge and education and learning simply for its own sake. It has its own inherent value and worth. But additionally, he argues that knowledge is a fundamental because it also leads us towards the journey towards God. And so he writes this, that knowledge is the foundation of bliss in this world and the next. It is thus the most excellent of deeds. In part, knowledge becomes vital because it is the foundation upon which good and right action might lead. Given the importance of knowledge, both for right action as well as for knowledge of God that ultimately leads to the hereafter, al-Ghazali has exalted the scholar to an extremely high role. In fact, he concludes this first section by examining the issue of governance. He argues that the governance of this world is intricately tied up in the governance of religion. This isn't to say that he argues for something like a Sharia state. It's a much more complex account than that. But he does argue that sultans, kings, and caliphs have an important role to play in commanding the right and forbidding the wrong. However, he also notes that their governance only can extend to outward deeds and not to inward deeds. And here is why the role of the scholar becomes important. He in fact says that the scholar has an important task as an heir to the prophet to, quote, extend over inner thoughts and attitudes. However, he argues that this is only for the elite, and that scholarly discourse largely fails to be applicable to the common people. And thus, al-Ghazali argues that in fact it is not being a scholar or a political leader that is the most important, but being a teacher, one who can admonish not only the elite, but also the common people, to lead them towards right action, but also to cultivate inward knowledge of God. So he writes this, thus, quote, teaching knowledge is from one point of view an aspect of worship of God. From another, it is an aspect of the vice-regency of God. In fact, it is the most exalted kind of vice-regency because God has opened the heart of the scholar to the knowledge that is his most intimate attribute. Thus, the scholar is like a trusted keeper of God's most precious treasures. Even more, he is permitted to spend it on anyone in need. And thus, the Book of Knowledge's opening introduction is just as much an argument about the importance of knowledge for everyone as it is an argument for the virtues and importance of teaching. Teaching that does not simply seek out engagement with political power, but also seeks to turn knowledge of the Islamic sciences towards the inward secrets of spiritual and theological journeys towards God. Given the importance of knowledge, of learning, and of teaching as central virtues that bring us close to God and govern the affairs of this world, the question that al-Ghazali asks is, what then becomes obligatory on every Muslim? He begins by citing two hadith, the first saying that, quote, seeking knowledge is an obligation on every Muslim, and another hadith that says you should seek knowledge, even if it takes you to China. Given this, it would seem that every Muslim is obligated to engage in the Islamic sciences. And Ghazali notes that, in fact, jurists argue that in order to have true knowledge, one must have an understanding of Arabic grammar, of the traditions of each madhab or school, of the practices and limits of analogy. The dialectical theologians argue for the importance of proofs of God, of understanding the eternality of God, of logic. Similarly, Sufis and exegetes have their own understandings of obligation. However, al-Ghazali has what you might consider a gradation in what he considers obligatory towards humans. In one sense, this is part of a long religious tradition of hierarchies of knowledge that are often shot through, as Zahra Ayubi's book, Gendered Morality, shows, with certain patriarchal or classist assumptions. But on the other hand, I think there's another more nuanced account of what he's at least trying to do here, which is to show that knowledge comes in stages. And so he argues that, first and foremost, the only obligatory knowledge to be a Muslim is the capacity to say with one's tongue and believe in one's heart the Shahada, that I confess that there is no God but God, and that I confess that Muhammad is the prophet of God. This is the foundation of all other knowledge, and that is the only actually true obligation. However, as he goes on, as one matures, as one engages, one then needs to learn and understand other things. When, in fact, it's time to learn to pray, one learns the positions and practices of prayer. In order to pray, one also then needs to know the traditions and practices of how one prepares oneself, one cleanses oneself. When the series and season of Ramadan comes, one needs to become aware of these practices. So knowledge then becomes contingent on one's own maturity as well as one's own context. He gives an example, for instance, that a Muslim may have no knowledge that eating pork is forbidden or drinking alcohol is forbidden if he has lived his entire life in a Muslim society that doesn't practice these things. However, once that Muslim goes on a journey or lives in, say, Britain and realizes that it's the custom to eat pork and drink alcohol, the Muslim is then obliged to understand why this is the case. However, he's insistent that the only fundamental communal obligation initially, that which grounds all other senses of knowledge, is this account of the Shahada, of one's understanding that there is no God but God, and Muhammad is the prophet of God. And it is the task of the teacher to unfold the meaning of this as it encounters new situations and new life contexts. Within this, the sciences of tafsir, of Sufi practices of dhikr, of kalam or dialectical or theology, as well as fiqh, have important but limited parts to play. And so what he goes on to do, and what we'll get to in our next video, is his analysis of the importance but also the limits of jurisprudence and theology in the science of the hereafter. I've gotten a few tweets and messages about how to follow along if you want to read. In terms of the English translation that I'm using, since this is a general audience and don't assume you're either a Muslim or have Arabic, I've been using this translation from Fons Vita. You can get it online, delivered to your house in quarantine if you'd like. There's also some other translations that aren't quite as good that you can find at ghazali.org, I believe. I'm not promoting them because I don't know if they're legal. In terms of the Arabic series, I'm using this one from, I think it's from Dar al-Minhaj, or Minhaj, which is a really beautiful text and really quite easy to read, and it's beautiful as well. It's a 10 volume. It's I don't know, around 200 pounds, but it's certainly worth the investment.